Imagine the global music stage as a high-stakes arena where the rules are written in gold and the gatekeepers are fiercely protective. When 7 young men from South Korea shattered the glass ceiling of the Western industry, they didn't just bring catchy tunes, they broke open doors that had been locked for decades. But behind the glitz and glamour, a darker reality simmered, a media landscape often fueled by prejudice, awkward snubs, and thinly veiled xenophobia. While many chose to stay silent, a few legendary icons decided to step into the line of fire. They didn't just collaborate, they stood as human shields against the tide of media bias. Who were the titans of the US industry that dared to challenge the status quo for the sake of 7 outsiders? Which world-renowned pop queen risked her reputation to shut down a room of critics? And who was the legend that called out the entire industry's hypocrisy? Let's unravel the secret history of the 10 global superstars who proved that respect knows no borders and loyalty is louder than the loudest media storm. Number 10. Halsey, the fearless sister in arms. The year was 2019, and the global music scene was trembling under the weight of a revolution that many in the Western establishment simply weren't ready to accept. As BTS began to dominate the charts, a segment of the Western media chose to weaponize a very specific, very toxic narrative, the manufactured label. They tried to paint these 7 artists as nothing more than products of a corporate machine, devoid of soul or agency, but they didn't realize that BTS had a fierce ally in Ashley Frangipani, known to the world as Halsey. The bond between Halsey and BTS wasn't just a calculated PR move for a hit single like Boy With Love, it was a genuine high-stakes friendship forged in the fires of industry scrutiny. While interviewers tried to trap her with leading questions, hoping she would admit that working with a K-pop group was difficult or purely transactional, Halsey did the exact opposite. She became a literal shield. I want you to picture this: a chaotic press room where the air is thick with skepticism, and Halsey stands there looking every critic in the eye and telling them that these men are some of the most dedicated, talented, and self-aware artists she has ever met. She didn't just stop at compliments, she went after the gatekeepers. Remember when Western radio stations were playing every mumble rap track on repeat, but suddenly developed quality concerns when it came to BTS's record-breaking hits? Halsey didn't stay quiet. She took to social media and interviews to call out the blatant xenophobia of the radio industry, demanding to know why a song with millions of fans and massive sales was being sidelined simply because it wasn't American enough. She saw the double standards, how Western boy bands were praised for their charm while BTS was scrutinized for their every move, and she dismantled that narrative piece by piece. There was this one specific moment during an interview where the host tried to imply that BTS's success was just a fandom fluke, and Halsey stopped them mid-sentence, reflecting on how their work ethic surpassed almost everyone she knew in Hollywood. She talked about how they practiced until their feet bled, how they wrote their own lyrics with a depth that most Western pop stars couldn't touch, and how they treated every staff member with a level of respect that is rare in the diva culture of the US. But the real mic drop moment came when she defended their artistry against the manufactured trope. She pointed out the hypocrisy of a Western industry that uses ghostwriters and auto-tune for its own stars, while accusing BTS, who are deeply involved in their production and choreography, of being puppets. This wasn't just a pop star defending her colleagues. This was a woman who had seen the ugly underbelly of fame and chose to stand with the outsiders. She even went as far as to call out the prestigious award shows that used BTS for clout and views while denying them the top-tier nominations they clearly deserved. Her advocacy was so intense that it actually forced some media outlets to rethink their tone. She wasn't afraid of the army being too loud. She was afraid of the industry being too deaf. Through her, many Westerners finally saw BTS not as a foreign phenomenon, but as a group of human beings with a message of self-love that resonated across borders. Halsey's defense was a masterclass in solidarity, showing that when you have a platform, the bravest thing you can do is use it to speak up for those whom the system is trying to silence. She proved that the sister of BTS wasn't just a title given by fans. It was a rank she earned through fire and brimstone. Can you imagine the pressure of being an American darling and telling the entire entire American music industry they are being biased and outdated. That is exactly what Halsey did, and in doing so, she became the first line of defense in a war for global musical respect. This wasn't just about music, it was about breaking the walls of a fortress that had been closed to the East for far too long. She didn't just collaborate on a song, she collaborated on a cultural shift that changed the way we perceive global stars forever. Now, think about this. If a powerhouse like Halsey had to fight this hard just to get people to listen, what does that say about the invisible barriers still standing in the way of global talent today? And more importantly, who was the next legend to step up when the media tried to turn a simple interview into a trap for the world's biggest band? Stay tuned, because the next name on our list didn't just defend them, he redefined what it meant to be a mentor in a cutthroat industry. Number 9. Steve Aoki. When you think of the high-octane, cake-throwing, adrenaline-pumping world of EDM, there is one name that towers above the rest, Steve Aoki. But in 2017, the Western media wasn't looking at Steve, they were looking at the 7 newcomers from Seoul who had just crashed the Billboard Music Awards like a tidal wave. While many US journalists were busy asking BTS, who do you want to date? Or which American artist do you want to meet? Treating them like a passing internet curiosity, Steve Aoki saw something much deeper. He saw a mirror of his own struggle as an Asian American artist who had to fight for every inch of respect in a Western-dominated industry. The narrative back then was incredibly dismissive. The media tried to frame BTS as a viral trend or a social media fluke, essentially saying their music didn't matter because the fans were just screaming girls. Steve Aoki stepped in and completely shattered that patronizing script. He didn't just give them a remix, he gave them a seal of legitimacy that the Western elite couldn't ignore. I want you to feel the tension of that era. BTS was on the verge of a massive breakthrough with Mic Drop, but the gatekeepers were still holding the keys tight. Steve Aoki, a veteran who had seen it all, spent hours in the studio and behind the scenes telling every reporter who would listen that these weren't just pop idols. They were world-class performers whose discipline put Western stars to shame. He often reflected on how he was moved by their humility, a trait that the media often misinterpreted as submissiveness or lack of personality. Aoki fought back against this, explaining in interview after interview that their politeness was actually a sign of their immense strength and groundedness. He became a vocal advocate against the manufactured narrative, constantly reminding the public that RM, Suga, and J-Hope were the architects of their own sound, writing and producing tracks that dealt with mental health and social commentary, topics many US pop stars were too afraid to touch. There was this one powerful moment during a press junket where a journalist tried to downplay the complexity of Mic Drop, and Steve Aoki essentially schooled them on the technical difficulty of BTS's choreography and the layers of their production. He didn't treat them like a feature on his track, he treated them like his younger brothers, coining the Aoki family term, which became a shield for the group. He knew that the media was waiting for them to trip up, to make a mistake, or to prove that they didn't belong in the upper echelons of the US charts. So Steve used his massive platform to shout from the rooftops that BTS was the future of music, period. He spoke about the truth untold collaboration with such emotional weight, defending the group's vocal range and their ability to convey raw pain across language barriers, something Western critics often used as a reason to ignore them. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a media that praised Despacito for its global reach, while questioning why BTS sang in Korean. Through his eyes, we saw the media's bias for what it was, a fear of the unknown. Steve Aoki wasn't just a collaborator, he was a mentor who navigated the choppy waters of Hollywood for them, warning them about the snakes in the grass and ensuring that their first real steps into the US mainstream were paved with genuine respect rather than exploitation. He once said in a deep, reflective interview that the passion of BTS and their army reminded him of why he started music in the first place, to break barriers and build a community. That kind of emotional defense from a titan like Aoki was a turning point. It forced the cool kids of the music industry to stop snickering and start listening. He proved that BTS wasn't a K-pop group trying to fit into America. They were a global powerhouse that America needed to catch up with. Number 8. Lizzo. The year was 2021, and the world was slowly emerging from the silence of the pandemic, but the noise surrounding BTS was louder than ever, and unfortunately, not all of it was music to the ears. While Butter and Permission to Dance were shattering records left and right, a subtle but venomous narrative was brewing in the back rooms of Western media outlets. Journalists and industry experts were desperately trying to categorize BTS as a transient obsession or a digital phenomenon, essentially stripping away their humanity humanity and their hard-earned status as genuine musicians. They were being treated like a curiosity in a glass case, admired for their numbers but mocked for the very passion that made them great. Enter Melissa Vivian Jefferson, known to every corner of the globe as Lizzo. Now, Lizzo isn't just a pop star, she is a force of nature, a classically trained flautist, and a woman who has spent her entire career fighting against the norms of a rigid industry. When she stepped into the BTS story, she didn't just come as a collaborator, she came as a fierce, outspoken big sister who had zero patience for the boy band stigma. You see, the Western media has this ancient, dusty habit of dismissing boy bands as disposable or manufactured for teenage girls, a label that carries a heavy undertone of misogyny and ageism. Lizzo saw this happening to BTS and decided to flip the table. I want you to imagine the scene at a major music festival or a high-profile interview where a reporter tries to bait an artist into making a snarky comment about the K-pop craze. Instead of playing along, Lizzo would take that opportunity to school the entire room on the technicality of their performance. She didn't just say they're good, she talked about the G-funk vibes in their tracks, the precision of their rap lines, and the sheer vocal athleticism required to do what they do while dancing at a level that most Western artists can't even dream of. But her defense went deeper than just music. She targeted the most insidious form of media bias, the dehumanization of the members. Western media often tried to paint BTS as a monolith, a single, indistinguishable unit, which is a common trope used to marginalize Asian artists. Lizzo fought this by publicly celebrating their individualities. She didn't just talk about BTS, she talked about V's soulful baritone, Jimin's ethereal stage presence, and the main character energy they each brought to the table. By doing this, she forced the media to look at them as 7 distinct human beings, 7 creators with their own stories. Remember that iconic moment when she was seen at a Harry Styles concert, vibing with the members like they were lifelong friends? The media tried to turn it into a clout-chasing headline, but Lizzo shut that down with a reflection that hit hard. She spoke about how the ARMY isn't just a fandom, but a reflection of the love and genuine kindness the group emits, a kindness that the cynical Western industry often mistakes for weakness. She challenged the radio stations that were hesitant to play Butter or Dynamite because they weren't American enough, asking why the industry was so terrified of a global shift. She once famously said in an interview that the talent BTS possesses is terrifying to the establishment because it can't be controlled or put in a box. She stood up against the language barrier excuse, pointing out the hypocrisy of an industry that consumes Latin music but suddenly develops comprehension issues when the lyrics are in Korean. Lizzo's defense was a masterclass in intersectional solidarity. As a black woman in America, she knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated and reduced to a stereotype, and she used that shared experience to build a bridge of respect that the media couldn't tear down. She made it cool for the US mainstream to admit that BTS wasn't just a K-pop group, but the biggest band in the world, period. She didn't let the interviewers move on to the next scandalous question. She held them accountable, demanding they show the same respect to these 7 men that they would show to a legendary rock band from the UK or a pop icon from the US. Her presence was like a protective aura, reminding everyone that if you come for BTS, you're coming for her too. This wasn't about likes or retweets for Lizzo, it was about the integrity of the art form she loves. She saw the soul behind the choreography, and she made sure the critics knew that their fad narrative was officially dead on arrival. Can you feel the weight of that transition? Can you imagine the courage it takes to tell the very journalists who help your career that they are being biased, xenophobic, and outdated? Lizzo did that without blinking. Number 7. Max. The year was 2021, a time when the world was already on edge, grappling with a global pandemic that had shuttered theaters, silenced stadiums, and turned the music industry into a ghost town of digital streams and lonely social media posts. But while the physical world was quiet, the digital airwaves were screaming with a toxic energy that many chose to ignore. It was during this fragile moment that a veteran German radio host, Matthias Matuschik, decided to unleash a tirade of xenophobia that sent shockwaves across the globe, comparing the 7 members of BTS to a virus that needed a vaccine. Now, in the high-stakes world of Western media, where every word is calculated for clicks and every endorsement is weighed against profit, most US stars might have chosen to play it safe. They might have waited for their PR teams to craft a polite, neutral statement, or simply looked the other way to avoid being dragged into a foreign controversy. But not Maxwell George Schneider, the American pop powerhouse known as Max. This wasn't just a matter of defending a colleague for him. This was personal. I want you to imagine the scene. Max sitting in his home in the United States, seeing his close friend Min Yoongi, the legendary Suga of BTS, and his bandmates being dehumanized on a public platform. He didn't wait for a press release. He didn't check the industry temperature. He stepped into the line of fire with a fury that was as cold as it was calculated. He took to social media and interviews to deliver a message that left the Western gatekeepers absolutely speechless. He didn't just call the comments rude, he called them exactly what they were: racist, xenophobic, and a symptom of a much deeper rot within the global media landscape. Max's relationship with BTS, and specifically Suga, was never about the clout that the cynical Western media loves to accuse American artists of seeking. It was a bond forged in the quiet corners of a recording studio, far away from the flashing lights and the prying eyes of the paparazzi. When they collaborated on Blueberry Eyes and Burn It, Max saw something that the Western journalists refused to acknowledge. He saw a group of men who were masters of their craft, poets of the modern age, who were being treated like a passing novelty simply because they didn't speak English as their first language. This was the core of Max's defense. He became a vocal critic of the othering that BTS faced in every US talk show and every radio interview. He reflected on how he had watched interviewers try to belittle their impact, asking them questions that felt more like a human zoo exhibit than a musical discussion. He was the one who pointed out the hypocrisy of an industry that would celebrate his own indie roots while calling BTS's massive self-made success manufactured. There was this one powerful moment where Max was being interviewed by a Western outlet, and the host tried to lead him into a narrative that BTS was just a social media phenomenon. Max shut it down instantly. He looked into the camera and talked about the hours he spent with Suga, discussing the technicalities of production, the nuances of lyricism, and the sheer weight of the responsibility they felt toward their fans. He made the interviewer feel the weight of their ignorance, effectively ending the fad conversation before it could even begin. He spoke with such raw emotion about the injustice of the language barrier argument, asking why the Western world was so comfortable listening to music they didn't understand as long as it came from the West, but suddenly became confused when it came from the East. His defense was a masterclass in true allyship. He didn't make it about himself, he made it about the truth. He reflected on the Blueberry Eyes music video where he and his wife learned Korean lyrics out of respect for Suga's verse, a gesture that was a silent middle finger to every media outlet that claimed Korean was too hard for the American public to digest. He was one of the few who stood up during the Bayern 3 scandal and didn't let the media sweep it under the rug as a misunderstanding. He demanded accountability, using his platform to remind the world that these 7 men were human beings first and stars second. He talked about the loneliness that comes with being a global pioneer, how BTS had to walk a path that no one had paved for them, all while the media was trying to trip them at every turn. Max's words were a shield because they were backed by genuine love. He saw the soul of the group and he refused to let the cool kids of the Western industry mock it. He once said in a deeply reflective interview that the passion of the BTS members saved him during a dark time in his own career, and he would be damned if he let the media's bias dim their light. Number 6. Pharrell Williams. Imagine the landscape of 2022, a time when the Western music industry was locked in a fierce, silent debate about the authenticity of global stars. While BTS was breaking every record imaginable, a segment of the elite Western press was still clinging to an outdated, borderline condescending narrative, trying to frame the group's success as a byproduct of systematic training rather than raw, unfiltered genius. They wanted to believe that 7 men from Korea couldn't possibly possess the same creative depth as a Western indie darling or a rock legend. But then, a literal titan of the American music industry, a man whose name is synonymous with the very evolution of modern pop, hip-hop, and fashion, decided to step into the arena. I'm talking about the legendary Pharrell Williams, the mastermind behind Happy, the genius of the Neptunes, and a creative director who sees the world in colors that most of us can't even imagine. When Pharrell sat down with RM for that historic Rolling Stone Musicians on Musicians cover, it wasn't just a casual chat, it was a strategic, high-level defense of BTS's entire existence as artists. Pharrell didn't just come to talk about music, he came to dismantle the manufactured label that the media had been trying to glue onto BTS for years. I want you to feel the weight of that moment. A 13-time Grammy winner, a mogul who has shaped the careers of everyone from Jay-Z to Gwen Stefani, looking at Kim Namjoon and telling the world, this man is a master. He didn't use the word idol, he used terms like extraordinary, architect, and visionary. The Western media had spent years asking BTS the same shallow questions about their favorite American food or who they wanted to date, essentially infantilizing them and treating them like a passing novelty. Pharrell did the exact opposite. He dived deep into the psychology of creation, asking RM about the heavy burden of being a global leader and the anxiety of the spotlight. By doing this, Pharrell forced the Western critics to see the humanity and the immense intellectual labor behind the BTS phenomenon. He spoke about their work as bespoke art, comparing their precision and dedication to the highest levels of craftsmanship in the world. He reflected on the system that the West loves to criticize, pointing out that every great artist has a process, and the BTS process was simply more disciplined and successful than anything Hollywood had seen in decades. Pharrell's defense was like a protective shield made of gold. He used his untouchable reputation to validate their struggle, effectively telling the gatekeepers of the industry that if they didn't respect BTS, they were officially out of touch with the future of art. He called out the hypocrisy of a Western media that praises rebellious stars for their chaotic lives, but mocks BTS for their professional excellence. There was this one incredibly moving moment during their conversation where Pharrell acknowledged the spiritual weight of what BTS does, how they carry the hopes of millions, and he defended their right to feel overwhelmed by it, something the media often ignored in favor of perfect headlines. He didn't just stop at words either. He teased a collaboration that sent shockwaves through the industry, signaling to every other US star that BTS wasn't just a feature to get views, but a creative powerhouse that even a legend like Pharrell was eager to work with. He saw the soul in their synchronization and the poetry in their rap lines, and he made sure the world knew that RM wasn't just a boy band member, but a peer of the highest order. Pharrell's intervention was a turning point because it elevated the conversation from pop culture trivia to cultural philosophy. He showed that the Western media's attempt to box BTS into a K-pop category was a form of creative segregation that he simply wouldn't stand for. He reflected on how he had seen many stars rise and fall, but he recognized in BTS a longevity that only comes from true substance. By publicly mentoring and standing in solidarity with RM, Pharrell gave the group a key to the inner sanctum of the American creative elite, a place that the media had tried to keep them out of for far too long. He proved that the coolest man in music didn't just find BTS impressive, he found them necessary. This wasn't about clout for a man who already has everything. This was about the integrity of the global music scene. He challenged the very journalists who were meant to be his peers, effectively saying, "Stop looking at the surface and start listening to the message." He made the media's bias look small-minded and outdated compared to his expansive, borderless vision. Pharrell's defense was a masterclass in how a legend protects the next generation of pioneers. Number 5. John Cena. The year was 2018, a pivotal, electric, and incredibly volatile moment in the history of global pop culture, where the sheer force of BTS was beginning to collide with the rigid, often cynical structures of the American media machine. For decades, the Western industry had a very specific, very condescending way of dealing with boy bands. They were treated as fleeting, disposable products meant only for screaming teenagers, a narrative that was steeped in a thick layer of hidden misogyny and intellectual elitism. When BTS arrived, the media tried to apply this same old, tired template, laughing off their massive success as a social media fluke and mocking their fans as obsessed young girls who didn't understand real music. But then, something happened that no one in Hollywood, from the boardrooms of New York to the studios of Los Angeles, could have ever predicted. A man who stands as the literal embodiment of traditional Western toughness, a 16-time WWE World Champion, a Hollywood powerhouse, and a cultural icon whose voice and face had defined a generation of sports entertainment, decided to step into the digital town square and draw a line in the sand. I am talking about the legendary John Cena. Now, you have to understand the sheer cultural dissonance of this moment. The Western media was busy trying to frame BTS as too soft or too foreign for the average American man. And here was the ultimate alpha figure, a man built like a mountain of granite, telling the world that he was a member of the BTS army. But John Cena's defense wasn't just a casual celebrity shout out for likes. It was a profound, deeply intellectual, and fiercely protective campaign that lasted for years and fundamentally changed the way the US media dared to talk about the group. While talk show hosts like Howard Stern or various radio personalities were making snide remarks about the group's appearance or the intensity of their fans, John Cena was doing something radical. He was talking about their message. He didn't just say he liked their beats. He went on national television and explained the map of the soul philosophy, diving into Carl Jung's psychological theories that BTS had woven into their lyrics. Imagine a room full of cynical journalists expecting a joke, and instead they get John Cena schooling them on the importance of self-love and the bravery it takes for 7 young men to be vulnerable in a world that demands perfection. He became a human shield for the fandom, famously stating that the army wasn't just a group of screaming girls, but a sophisticated global community of people who were actually changing the world for the better. He reflected on his own career, drawing parallels between the discipline required in the wrestling ring and the grueling training and artistry of BTS, effectively telling every tough guy critic in America that if they didn't respect BTS, they were the ones who were weak. There was this one incredibly moving moment where the media tried to bait him into admitting that his interest in BTS was a marketing stunt, and Cena turned the tables with a reflection that felt like a documentary monologue, talking about how RM's lyrics about the inner child and the shadow had helped him navigate his own life as a public figure. He was one of the first Western stars to explicitly call out the media for their othering of BTS, pointing out that the only reason people were mocking them was because they were terrified of something they couldn't control. He used his massive platform to remind the gatekeepers that while they were busy making jokes, BTS was busy making history. Cena's defense was so powerful because it broke the gendered and racial stereotypes that the Western media used as a weapon. By being a fan, he made it safe for a whole new demographic of people to admit that these 7 men from South Korea were the real deal. He talked about the mic drop energy and the DNA complexity with the same fervor he used to talk about world titles, forcing the music critics to actually listen to the production instead of just looking at the hair color. He even went as far as to offer his services as a bodyguard during their visits to the US, a symbolic gesture that told the paparazzi and the rude interviewers, if you want to disrespect them, you have to go through me. His presence was a constant, stabilizing force throughout the 2018 and 2019 award seasons, a time when the media was at its most aggressive. He reflected on the burden of the pioneer, explaining to the press that what BTS was doing was harder than what any Western artist had to face because they were doing it while carrying the weight of an entire culture on their shoulders. John Cena didn't just defend a band, he defended a movement. Number 4. Nicki Minaj. The year was 2018, a time of absolute sonic warfare in the global music industry where the very definition of mainstream was being rewritten by a force that the Western elite still desperately wanted to categorize as a foreign anomaly. BTS was preparing to drop Idol, a track that wasn't just a song, but a vibrant, roaring declaration of cultural identity and self-acceptance, blending traditional Korean rhythms with the high-octane energy of South African Gqeom. But the Western media, always looking for a way to undermine the group's organic growth, was sharpening its knives, ready to claim that BTS was chasing Western validation by seeking high-profile American features. At the same time, the industry was obsessed with pitting legends against each other, and there was no legend more formidable, more outspoken, and more scrutinized than the queen of rap herself, Nicki Minaj. When the news broke that Nicki was featuring on the Idol remix, the media didn't just report it, they tried to turn it into a narrative of desperation and clout chasing on both sides. I want you to feel the heavy electric tension of that moment. The Western critics were practically salivating, waiting for a slip-up, waiting for Nicki to treat them like just another check, or for BTS to seem out of their depth in the presence of a rap titan. But what the media didn't count on was that Annika Tanya Mirage is a woman who has spent her entire career being the outsider in a male-dominated industry, and she recognized the same fire, the same discipline, and the same underdog spirit in those 7 men from Seoul. Nicki didn't just record a verse and walk away. She became a vocal, fierce, and unapologetic shield for BTS at a time when the US radio and press were still treating them like a passing circus act. While some Western journalists tried to imply that the collaboration was a marketing ploy to manipulate the Billboard charts, Nicki took to her legendary Queen Radio and her social media platforms to deliver a masterclass in industry respect. She didn't just call them talented, she spoke about their flow, their presence, and their unmatched work ethic, essentially telling the gatekeepers of the hip-hop world that if they were looking down on BTS, they were looking down on her too. She reflected on the pioneer struggle, acknowledging that what BTS was doing, breaking into a Western market that was historically hostile to Asian artists, mirrored her own struggle to be taken seriously as a female lyricist in the early 2000s. The media tried to stir up drama between the Barbs and the ARMY, but Nicki shut that down by embracing the fans as a single, unstoppable global force for good. There was this one specific high-stakes moment during the Idol music video release where critics were nitpicking the over-the-top aesthetics, and Nicki stepped in to validate the artistic vision, explaining that the boldness of BTS was exactly what the industry needed to break its boring, repetitive cycle. She spoke with a raw, emotional intensity about how the group's message of loving yourself resonated with her personally, a detail the cynical press tried to ignore in favor of focusing on stream counts. Nicki's defense was a turning point because it brought street cred and hip-hop legitimacy to a group that the West was trying to box into a soft pop category. She reminded the world that RM, Suga, and J-Hope were rappers first, and she treated their verses with the same reverence she would show a Western legend. She didn't let the interviewers control the narrative. She made sure they knew that she was the one who was honored to be on the track. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a sisterhood of resilience. She saw the soul in their eyes and the history in their dance moves, and she made it clear that anyone trying to belittle BTS's impact was corny and out of touch. Her presence was like a suit of armor for the group during the 2018 award season, a time when the media was still making subtitled jokes and questioning their longevity. Nicki Minaj proved that true royalty doesn't feel threatened by the rise of new kings. It recognizes the crown they've earned through blood, sweat, and tears. She was the one who told the US radio stations to play the damn record, calling out the invisible barriers that were still trying to silence a global revolution. She reflected on the beauty of the Korean language, telling her millions of followers that music has no borders, effectively silencing the "I don't understand the lyrics" excuse that Western critics had been using for years. Through her, the narrative shifted from "Why is Nicki doing this?" to "Why isn't everyone else as brave as Nicki?" She didn't just provide a feature, she provided a shield of cool that the media couldn't penetrate.
Number 3. Anderson .Paak. The year was 2022, and the air in Las Vegas was thick with a mixture of high-stakes electricity and a lingering, icy tension that only the music industry's biggest night can produce. BTS was standing on the precipice of history, having delivered a butter performance that many critics later called the greatest live act the Grammys had seen in a decade. A flawless, high-wire heist routine that combined James Bond suave with Michael Jackson precision. Yet, despite the standing ovation from the world's most elite stars, a familiar and ugly narrative was already being sharpened in the backrooms of Western media outlets. Journalists and industry purists were preparing their headlines, ready to once again dismiss the group as mere entertainers or view bait for a ceremony that they felt still belonged to the Western old guard. They were waiting for BTS to walk away empty-handed so they could write about the death of a trend. But they didn't count on the intervention of a man who represents the very pinnacle of soulful authenticity and musical genius, the 8-time Grammy winner, one half of Silk Sonic, and a virtuoso drummer and vocalist, Anderson .Paak. Now you have to understand the weight of Anderson's voice in this specific context. He is a musician's musician, a man who lives and breathes the technicality of rhythm and soul, and someone the Western media could never accuse of being manufactured. When the cameras stopped rolling and the media tried to paint the night as a defeat for BTS, Anderson .Paak stepped into the line of fire as a human shield of respect and genuine brotherhood. He didn't just give them a polite nod for the cameras, he spent the night and the following days dismantling the media's us versus them narrative with a raw, emotional intensity that left the cynical critics stunned. I want you to picture the scene. While the Western press was busy trying to find flaws in BTS's performance to justify their loss, Anderson was backstage and in the front rows treating the 7 members not as K-pop idols, but as his direct peers, his equals in the craft of soul. He famously took to his massive platforms to showcase his genuine bond with them, but it was his words in the aftermath that really hit the media where it hurt. He reflected on the sheer inhuman level of talent and discipline the group possessed, effectively calling out the hypocrisy of a Western industry that celebrates average Western stars while moving the goalposts for BTS. Anderson saw the vulnerability in the members' eyes, the quiet disappointment of being used for ratings by a system that still hesitated to give them the ultimate trophy, and he chose to be the warmth they needed in the middle of that Hollywood coldness. He didn't let the interviewers frame BTS as outsiders anymore. Instead, he integrated them into the Silk Sonic universe, a space reserved for only the most elite, soulful artists in the world, telling the world that if you don't get BTS, you don't get music. There was this incredibly moving, reflective moment where Anderson spoke about how he watched them practice and how their dedication reminded him of the legends of Motown, a comparison that the Western media had tried to gatekeep for years. He challenged the clout chaser label that the media loves to throw at American artists who support BTS by showing that his love for them was rooted in his family, his son, and his own professional admiration for their live capability. He became a vocal critic of the lip-sync accusations that Western outlets often use to belittle Asian performers, point-blank telling the press that BTS's vocal and choreographic stamina was scary and unmatched by anyone currently on the US charts. He reflected on the tears of the night, not just of sadness, but of the immense pressure these 7 men carried, and he used his platform to remind the media that these were human beings with hearts of gold, not just machines. Anderson's defense was a masterclass in breaking the glass ceiling of the Western elite. He used his untouchable credibility to validate their artistry in the one room where the media still tried to deny it. He stood up against the language barrier nonsense yet again, pointing out that the soul in Jimin's voice or the rhythm in J-Hope's dance was a universal language that the media was being too arrogant to learn. He didn't just defend their music, he defended their right to be tired, their right to be frustrated, and their right to be respected as the hardest-working artists in the business. Through Anderson's eyes, the public didn't see a K-pop group that lost a Grammy. They saw a group of world-class legends who were being treated unfairly by an outdated system, and Anderson was the one who made sure the media felt the sting of that injustice. Number 2. Lady Gaga. The year was 2022, a night where the neon lights of Las Vegas seemed to pulse with a nervous energy that could be felt across the entire globe. But to understand the magnitude of what happened, we have to go back to the origins of this tension. For years, the Western media had been playing a dangerous game of gatekeeping, creating an invisible but impenetrable wall around the elite circles of the music industry. While BTS was shattering every digital record in existence, the traditional Western press and the old guard of Hollywood were still treating them like a curiosity, a foreign entity that was allowed to visit the party but never truly sit at the head of the table. They were often subjected to subtle microaggressions in interviews, reporters asking about their screaming fans as if the music itself didn't exist, or critics implying that their success was merely a result of social media algorithms rather than sheer undeniable talent. There was a sense of othering that was palpable every time they walked a red carpet. But then, in the middle of this high-stakes environment at the 64th Grammy Awards, a figure emerged who possesses a cultural gravity so immense that the entire industry stops to breathe when she speaks. I am talking about Stefani Joanne Angelina Germanotta, known to every soul on this planet as Lady Gaga. Now, you have to realize that Gaga is more than just a pop star. She is the mother monster, a symbol of the misfits, and a woman who has spent her life defending the dignity of those who are seen as different or outsiders by the establishment. When the cameras caught that legendary whispered interaction between Lady Gaga and Kim Tae-hyung, it wasn't just a celebrity moment for the tabloids. It was a tactical, high-level defense of BTS's place in the pantheon of legends. I want you to feel the atmosphere of that room. The media was waiting for BTS to be sidelined, waiting for them to be treated as fans who were lucky to be there. Instead, Gaga did something that silenced the critics in an instant. She treated them with a level of reverence and artistic peerage that the Western media had been trying to deny them for half a decade. She didn't just pose for a photo, she leaned in, shared a moment of genuine, soulful connection, and effectively anointed them as her equals in front of the very journalists who had spent years belittling them. This was a masterclass in industry protection. Gaga knew that by publicly embracing the group, she was sending a clear, undeniable message to the Western gatekeepers. If you respect me, you respect them. She reflected on the loneliness of being a pioneer, a feeling she knew all too well from her own career, and she became a shield for their humanity. While the media was busy analyzing their impact on the market, Gaga was validating their impact on the soul. Her defense was silent but roared louder than any headline. She spoke about the purity of their art in subsequent reflections, challenging the cynical narrative that their work was manufactured. She saw the theater in their performances, the opera in their staging, and the raw vulnerability in their lyrics, things the Western critics often ignored because they were too busy counting their YouTube views. By treating BTS with the same level of respect she would show a Tony Bennett or a David Bowie, she forced the American industry to stop looking at them through the lens of K-pop and start looking at them through the lens of high art. This wasn't just about a vibe, it was about the First Lady of Pop, taking a stand against the structural bias of the industry she helped build. She reflected on how she had watched them navigate the snakes of the business with a grace that was superhuman, and she used her untouchable status to ensure that the media's boy band mockery died right then and there. I want you to imagine the internal panic of a journalist who was about to write a snarky piece about BTS, only to see the queen of the industry herself treating them like royalty. Gaga's defense was a blessing that effectively signaled the end of the outsider era for BTS in the US. She made it clear that they weren't just a trend, they were the new standard of excellence. She defended their right to be emotional, their right to be complex, and their right to lead the global conversation. She was the mother figure they needed in the cold, transactional halls of Hollywood, a woman who didn't care about clout because she is the clout. Her protection gave them a psychological armor that the media couldn't pierce, because how do you argue with Lady Gaga? She saw the soul behind the global phenomenon, and she made sure the world knew that Kim Tae-hyung and his brothers weren't just stars, they were the future of music itself. Can you feel the weight of that validation?
Number 1. Jimmy Fallon, the American king of late night who built the Eternal Bridge. The year was 2018, a time when the American late-night television circuit was still largely a fortress of traditional Western comedy, often leaning on low-hanging fruit and cultural stereotypes for easy laughs. For decades, the format had been the ultimate gatekeeper of what was considered mainstream and cool in the United States, and for many international artists, it was a gauntlet of awkward translations, fish-out-of-water segments, and a subtle sense of being treated as a novelty act rather than a serious creative force. When BTS first stepped onto the set of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, the Western media was at a crossroads. Some were beginning to see the massive digital numbers, but many were still waiting for them to fail or to prove they were just a passing internet meme. But James Thomas Fallon, a man whose career was built on the intersection of music, comedy, and genuine fanboy enthusiasm, decided to shatter that glass ceiling before the first commercial break even aired. I want you to feel the palpable electric energy of that studio. While other hosts might have approached 7 non-English speaking guests with a patronizing slow talk or a funny foreigner gimmick, Jimmy Fallon treated them with a level of frantic, joyful reverence that sent shockwaves through the industry. He didn't just invite them for a 3-minute interview, he invited them into the very DNA of his show. He was the first to recognize that the boy band stigma being used by the media to belittle them was actually their greatest strength, a bond of brotherhood and discipline that the West hadn't seen since the days of the Beatles. Jimmy's defense of BTS wasn't a single event, it was a years-long campaign of validation that fundamentally changed the way the American public perceived global stars. Think back to the BTS week in 2020, an unprecedented, historic 5-night residency that transformed The Tonight Show into a global sanctuary for artistry during the darkest days of the pandemic. While the rest of the media was questioning whether BTS could maintain their momentum without a physical tour, Jimmy gave them the keys to the kingdom. He didn't just let them perform, He stood as their most visible American champion, calling them the biggest band in the world at a time when major news outlets were still using the word K-pop group like it was a category for a niche market. He reflected on his own friendship with Jimin, turning the Chimmy headband moment from a cute joke into a symbol of genuine human connection that transcended language barriers, a direct defiance of the xenophobic narratives that tried to paint the group as unreachable or alien. Jimmy Fallon was the one who pushed for the historic Grand Central Terminal performance of On, a feat of logistics and artistic ambition that the media tried to downplay, but which Jimmy framed as a gift to a city in need of hope. He spoke with such raw emotional detail about their humility, constantly reminding the cynical press that despite their godlike status, these 7 men were the kindest, most hardworking individuals he had ever hosted in his decades-long career. He became a shield for the army as well, defending the fandom from the crazy fan trope by explaining to his massive audience that the fans were actually a sophisticated, diverse, and brilliant collective of people who were driven by a message of self-love. There was this one incredibly powerful moment when a journalist tried to lead Jimmy into a conversation about BTS being a trend, and Jimmy shut it down with a reflection that felt like a documentary monologue, talking about how the group's work ethic and their live capability made almost every other artist in the industry look like they were taking a day off. He was the first to call out the hypocrisy of award shows that used BTS for ratings, but failed to give them the top-tier nominations. And he did so not with anger, but with a relentless positive pressure that forced the industry to look in the mirror. He saw the soul in their choreography and the intellect in their rap line, and he made sure that every guest on his show, from Hollywood actors to politicians, knew that they were in the presence of greatness when BTS was mentioned. Jimmy Fallon didn't just build a bridge, he sat on that bridge and defended it from every critic who tried to tear it down. He reflected on the Dynamite era as a turning point for global unity, telling the media that if they were confused by the success of a Korean group singing in English, it was because they were living in the past. His defense was so effective because it was backed by the most powerful platform in America, and he used it to ensure that BTS wasn't just visiting Hollywood, but that they were conquering it on their own terms.